Welcome to the Unhurried Living podcast. My name is Alan Fadling, and I invite you to listen to leadership conversations that will help you to develop healthy rhythms of rest and work, and to live fuller in friendship with God. I hope this podcast will help you to overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 198 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Each week on the podcast, we have leadership conversations to help us lead better in the spirit of Jesus' unhurried way, the way of leadership that flows from a full soul instead of an empty one. Sometimes I'm talking with fellow authors, and sometimes I'm talking with leaders just like you, who are learning to live and lead at the fruitful pace of grace and peace. Now, today I'm talking with Ashley Hales about her new book, A Spacious Life. You can imagine how many good intersections I found with my first book, An Unhurried Life. I wrote a book with a title focused on time. Ashley's written a book with a title focused on space. But we're both talking about the great challenge and cost of hurry, and God's invitation to live our lives at the slower yet more fruitful pace of God's kingdom. I know you're going to be encouraged by what Ashley shares here in a few moments. Ashley Hales is a writer, speaker, and host of the Finding Holy podcast. She's the author of Finding Holy in the Suburbs, and her writing has been featured in Christianity Today, Books and Culture, and the Gospel Coalition. Ashley is married to a pastor and the mother to 4 children. If you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, please follow, rate, and review. And be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Ashley Hales. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Ashley Hales, author of A Spacious Life. Ashley, thank you for joining me for this conversation.
You are so welcome. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, I love to begin a conversation about a book with an author by asking if you could share a little bit of the story of how the book came to be.
You know, I was, it came in frustration, honestly. I think, I'd experienced, especially maybe about 15 years ago, as a new young mother, my limitations of my time and my body. And I think I was mad at God for a little bit about that. You know, Wendell Berry talks about we live the given life and not the planned. And I really wanted to live my planned life. So it kind of came, from that. And then also seen a lot of works out in the last several years that would kind of qualify as self-help that really said, even Christian books, like you should be unlimited and you have no limits and it's up to you to go get after it. And that is not the way of Jesus. And so there was that picture, of anger too. Really it kind of transformed, especially through the months of the pandemic as it was wearing on, into realizing that we don't need more arguments picking apart things. We really do need invitations. And so the tone of the book changed, at that point, I think a little bit, as much as I would love to have a good argument, but to remember that we ultimately are being invited into something altogether new and more beautiful.
Yeah, I love that language of invitation. I really think it speaks to the way grace lies at the heart of who God is and what God's way with us is. And you mentioned that this idea of limits, it's a real key idea as I was reading through your book, that we live in a world, as you say, that we don't want limits, or we even imagine we don't have any. Right. Maybe there's some bad limits, but there's some really, really good limits too. Can you talk a little more about that, please?
Yeah. Well, I think, we often just gloss over, the beginning chapters of the Bible and don't actually realize that limits are a part of creation, that they're good things. That creatures were given limits. They could, the apple tree can only produce apples, and planets have orbits, and the ground has it's designed to have cycles and seasons. And people are like that too. And so I think we've often chosen in our upwardly mobile Western 21st century lives to ignore our limits of our body or of seasons. We've ignored limits of our time or attention or our calling or vocation in favor of this idea that really what will make me happy is to be this kind of autonomous, unconstrained individual. And so we find ourselves exhausted and hurried by that hustle, that most of us choose to live that story. And so the book really is an invitation to remember our good God-given creaturely limits as invitations to knowing God and making him known. But it also doesn't shy away from the fact that living within God's guardrails will be painful. And, the way the pattern of Jesus's life went to the cross, and ours will, in their own small ways, go through dark valleys too. But I think if we press into our limits, crying out to God with hard seasons, experiencing the fallenness of our bodies, that we will find we have our Savior there with us. So that's really the end goal. It's not, the vacation or, the quiet house or what have you that we think looks like spaciousness.
Yeah. Well, I really like that. I think the idea of limits or boundaries, we might imagine that they are withholding something from us. Like there's something on the other side of that boundary I really want, or maybe even I really need. And now there's a big fat no in front of me. And I don't get instead of maybe it's protecting us for that which is truly good and really God-given. You talked about in the book about, our sort of common understanding of freedom equals unlimited autonomy. Like whatever flits through my brain, I should be free to do it, pursue it, chase it,
right,
realize it, whatever.
Yeah.
But, you're talking about freedom as it's defined very differently, defined more in the spirit of the kingdom. Can you say more about that finding freedom?
I think in the very beginning of the book, in the epigraph, I have a little bit from The Last Battle, the final book in the Chronicles of Narnia, where it's the Pevensey children and King Tyrion, and they get stuck in the stable, which had been the headquarters of this false god Tash, and they're really freaked out, like, oh no, we're gonna be annihilated. And they find they're actually in Aslan's country, and Tyrion says, it seems to me that the inside is actually bigger than the outside. And Lucy says a very famous line about, in our world too, a stable once held the whole world. And, I think it's such a reminder to us as we look at the guardrails of God's good life for us, we can tend to think of them as restrictive. It looks like that ugly stable. We're really scared about it, but we can find, as we actually enter into it, as we practice rhythms of prayer and, turning off our phones and, walking at a human pace and, really realizing that these limits, like you were saying, can be really protective for our good. We'll find that the inside is actually bigger. And so there's a sense of like internal spaciousness that really develops as, it's sort of like what Paul was saying when he's learned the secret of being content in all circumstances and want and in plenty. And I think that's really what I'm trying to get at, is through these invitations, through actually submitting ourselves to God's good limits, we'll begin to experience a freedom that isn't contingent on our circumstances or our health, which is actually what real freedom looks like.
Yeah. So I love that image of spaciousness. I always have loved that idea in the Chronicles about the inside bigger than the outside. There's something beautiful about that. There is a freedom of soul that is far more spacious than the kind of unlimited, anything I want, anything I feel, any impulse I have, which is actually incredibly limiting of the freedom that I'm actually invited to. You talk in one of your chapters about how smallness, mean, maybe to kind of follow on this conversation we've had so far, is really a gift of God's kingdom. Jesus loves to talk about seeds, for example, pretty small stuff. That smallness is an essential dynamic in God's way with us, whereas we think bigger, better. That's our cultural assumption.
Right.
Talk some about how smallness is really a gift, really an invitation.
I think, smallness is also another way to think about the gift of self-forgetfulness as well, right? When we feel like we need to be big, or to spread ourselves out thinly, we really are losing attention for other people and ourselves and God. There's something really beautiful, about a small life, that isn't on a big stage or a platform, or, needing to weigh in on, the latest thing on the news, because there's a sense in which you can choose to cultivate quieter disciplines, that you can pay attention to your place, that you can pay attention to people. We see Jesus doing that, right? All throughout the Gospels, not only, that he uses small things like wheat and seeds and pearls, even, in his parables and in his teaching, but also, that he lived a very small life, a very local life. And for us to think that the way that we get worth and, we can, quote unquote, do big things for God is really foolhardy. And, ultimately, even those people who are given those sorts of platforms, they still have to put on their pants one leg at a time. They still live in real houses with real people, with real communities too. And so I think there are disciplines, no matter our influence, that we can really cultivate towards smallness that I think will really be, it's countercultural. It might feel a little scary to choose to say no to maybe some of those things, but that seems to be the way of Jesus.
Yeah, I like that idea, the qualitative nature, the quality of what is big, how Jesus measures big seems different than the way our culture is. I think of my own journey, there have been times when I've had what felt like big opportunities and I was happy for them. But when I look back, those don't prove to be, in my imagination, the most fruitful moments of my life.
Yeah, that's good.
More often, it was an invisible moment or a small moment or a nobody knew about it moment.
Yeah.
But 5, 10, 20, 30 years later, it still matters to me. And it feels like it probably still matters to God.
I take great encouragement just thinking about, like the work of parenting, for instance. I have 4 children and just realizing, hopefully, Lord willing, these children will follow Jesus and their children will. And, and that becomes a ripple effect of when anything I've said or written is forgotten, that there will be a string, I hope, of Christ followers. And we just don't know what that will look like. And so it's encouraging and hopeful, right? In those seasons when you're planting seeds or you feel like the seed underground who's died and you don't know what's next. Yeah. We don't know what's going to really produce a harvest.
That's true. Yeah. Well, in one of your chapters, you talk a bit about social media and about our devices, which have had a way of really accelerating and I was going to say expanding, but I'm almost want to use a more graphic word like bloating our lives, just filling us with so much stuff. And it really contributes to this problem of hurry that you're saying so much about in the book. Can you talk about some of the practicalities of this social media / device obsession that is common for so many of us?
Well, I think we definitely turn to our phones or to media more generally to often bypass or ignore our limits. Often we run to them for comfort. So I think that's a first, like a good little internal check. But really, I think it's important for us to recognize how media and social media particularly is forming us.
Yes.
The way in which it helped, we're no longer able to wait. It's harder to abide nuance. The kind of patient unfolding of a life isn't really noteworthy on social media. People don't say, I'm sorry. There's not like a lifestyle of repentance on social media, people just shouting. And so to remember that this too is forming us. And then it also gives us this illusion of kind of godlike power. We can be in and out of conversations that are really happening all over the world, right? Not only do we have opinions about everything that's happening all over the world, but we can comment on, someone who lives in Australia or someone who lives in Europe or Africa on Twitter. And so we begin to bypass our embodied real limits, right? We can opt out of the pain of our local churches by instead choosing to form communities online. We can opt out of the awkward conversations with your neighbor. And so much of our character development and so much of who we are in Christ really comes out in those local, embodied long-term relationships. And we it's not to say that, for like throw away your TV and throw away your phone, but it is to say we need to be cognizant and put good boundaries around those sorts of things so that they don't become the default.
Yeah, but it feels sometimes, default's a really good word. It feels like I walk into a restaurant and folks aren't chatting. They're all waiting for the meal. And so we're waiting and we'll all look at our phones and
right.
having a conversation. So I really agree with you. These devices that we've created are forming us. They really are. And we might want to ask ourselves if we like what they're forming in us. We may decide we don't like what they're forming.
Right.
So I think that's a really important question. In another chapter, you talk about the dynamic of rest, and that's a theme we talk a lot about too. I had a chance just yesterday to chat with Matthew Sleeth, and of course, he wrote a book on Sabbath, 24/6, which is a wonderful little book. But you also talk about this, and I was having a conversation with a group of leaders just the other day, kind of in a coaching group. They have very full schedules, they have lots of commitments, and they're just trying to wrap their head around what in the world is rest for me? Like, how does that actually work? Can you share a little bit about your own journey of experiencing God's gift of rest as a part of this life to which God's invited us?
I think what is just so transformative is to remember that, in the Hebrew scriptures, the day starts in the night, right? And that really rest is the first word, which means that grace is really the first word. Because we often cycle between production and escape. So we work really hard and then we escape, and we're not even experiencing restorative rest either. And so we kind of treat ourselves like machines that we plug in, like our iPhones, to recharge. And so rest is that kind of, we view it as, well, I've worked really hard and now I'm going to collapse exhausted. And this is how I'm recharging. But if rest is the first word, if grace is the first word, then really our week, our days start with rest. And our work then becomes a response to the rest we've been given, which is hugely transformative. In my own life, I think a lot of it really happened as just in the last several years, my husband and I have led other folks through the emotionally healthy discipleship program that Pete Scazzaro has done. Yeah. And, he encourages, there's like a 40-day devotional daily office where you're starting in silence. And that's morning and evening, and beginning to build those rhythms in our days where you come to the Word of God first, you come in silence first, you receive first before, you're checking your email, and practicing Sabbath too. I think my husband's a pastor, and so it is a work day still for him, but, so it's kind of complicated, but, he kind of has half Sabbath, half work, and his Sabbath is another day. But me and the kids, Sunday's our Sabbath. And so we've tried to, practice good rhythms as a family and eating dessert, and part of it too is like, I don't want these pastors' kids to, hate church because they're there all the time, or, so many people have to weigh in on their lives. But, so we celebrate, God's goodness to us. So some of those sorts of practices and habits have really been formative. And even just in all of the marketing and publicity necessary for book launching, I've realized like I can't very well hustle and hurry. and
Right.
do it all when that's what the message of the book is.
Kind of off brand, perhaps.
Right. I know. As much as I would like to hustle and hurry, but, to realize, okay, what are good, healthy rhythms, even for work? What does that look like? And so, some of that is, how can I put, interviews on just one day a week so that I can be a mom over here, and, all of those sorts of things. They don't solve the problem, but I think they create margin in our lives to be able for work to find its proper place.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when I work with a lot of men and women in church and ministry leadership, and you get this sort of subtle sense that they're very clear that God's given them work to do.
Yeah.
They know that.
Right.
But the idea that Jesus might also be inviting them to come away with him to a quiet place to rest, like he did once when things got crazy in the lives of the disciples, that for some just seems unimaginable.
Yeah. Right. And what's the cost, right? When we are doing so much for God and yet not being with him.
That's absolutely right. So, who we're becoming is Dallas always said, that's the great gift we give to God, is who we're becoming in him. And, well, I enjoyed all of your chapter themes. I wish we had time to talk about all of them, but what I'd love to just ask is there one of the themes that we haven't touched yet that you'd like to say something about?
Well, what some of my early readers have really loved the chapter on the church, on the goodness of gathered salt.
Nice.
And I mean, part of it's fun because I talk about salt a lot, and I bring out some, the author of Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Samin Nosrat, and she had a Netflix special. So anyway, it was really fun to kind of integrate, like, what does salt actually do? And what is Jesus doing when he talks about, being the salt and the light of the world. And so one thing I think that was just really fun to explore in that chapter was, salt isn't very good at doing what it's supposed to do by itself. And so much of our kind of Western upwardly mobile lives, we've just really prioritized the individual. Even the nuclear family, it, doesn't feel like integrated into the life of its community and culture and church. And I think it was so fun to think about, okay, we are supposed to be like handfuls of salt, right? That Jesus is like tossing into the boiling water, right? For pasta, to actually make pasta taste better, taste like it should. And to realize that the purpose of salt is not to be like, look at me, I'm so amazing, right? But it's actually, our life is for the life of the world. And so it was really fun just to explore that, and also to talk about, there's certain constraints of community, and there's constraints of the church, and it doesn't always feel nice. Because I think a lot of times we think our limits, oh, great, you're giving me permission to say no to everything that I want to say no to. But maybe sometimes the limits that Jesus is inviting us into are limits that we would rather say no to, but he's inviting us to say yes to. And I think, the church and community and our places are part of that. Yes, that may rub us a little bit, but make us do what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, I love I love your title, A Spacious Life. The subtitle is Trading Hustle and Hurry for the Goodness of Limits. And of course, the name of our little nonprofit is Unhurried Living. So that was right up our alley.
Yep.
I wonder if I could ask you just in closing to share a word of encouragement to our listeners, many of whom I think listen to this podcast because Hurry has been, as it has been for me, a place of ongoing recovery.
Yeah.
Still learning how to live at the pace of peace and grace and love, which are a slower pace than the one I grew up learning so many years ago. Maybe just a word of encouragement to those who are listening.
Yeah. I would just encourage you, if you are listening, to realize that maybe your hurry and hustle do not bar you from the kind attention of Christ. That he sees you, he sees the pressures that you're under, he knows them, and to encourage you that his limits are good news. I know sometimes they feel a little like restrictive, But, if Jesus says to take his yoke upon us and to learn from him, and we will learn the unforced rhythms of grace, as Eugene Peterson kind of paraphrases that bit in Matthew, that actually is good news. And, as you're listening to so many episodes on this podcast and you experience that sense of spaciousness, just encourage you to dive in and to follow where Jesus leads, and that there's grace there.
Well, thank you. Again, our guest today has been Ashley Hales, and we've been talking about her book, A Spacious Life. Ashley, it's really been a pleasure to have this visit.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Wasn't that a great conversation? I was so happy to find a kindred spirit in Ashley. I was refreshed and encouraged in my own continuing journey of recovery from my addiction to hurry in my life, my relationships, and my work. Towards the end, Ashley used an image Jesus loved to use to describe our relationship to him. It's an image that can sound limiting. It's the image of a yoke. Now, unless you happen to be an artisan farmer, it's pretty unlikely that you've ever actually used a yoke to do a piece of work. In the day of Jesus, it was a way of harnessing a couple of work animals to pull a wagon or a plow. Jesus says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Now, he doesn't mean that life with him is always trouble-free. It's simply that the yoke of Jesus fits us just right, and it isn't burdensome in itself. I can think of at least two reasons that it makes our work and our service of God better or lighter. And that is, one, we aren't in that yoke alone. Jesus doesn't hand it to us and we go running off bearing it on our own. We are in the yoke together with Christ. We are in collaboration with Jesus in whatever work we find ourselves doing. There's a second reason that I think his yoke is easy, that it fits well. And it is that we are not the ones carrying the heavy end of the yoke. Jesus, in fact, is the one doing that. Now, the limits God invites us into are meant to protect the abundant life he wishes to grow in us and to grow us in. Limits are actually good news. So I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. In the next few episodes, we'll be talking with authors Stephen Arterburn, Brian Zond, and Alice Freiling. We'll also have conversations with leaders like you on topics like making space to notice God's presence in our busy lives and learning to live and work at the pace of love, that greatest commandment that God has given us. I can't wait to share those episodes with you. Now, if you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried Daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We are honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.